I'm just going to introduce myself briefly. My main interests are in, well, a wide range of topics. I teach Shakespeare, science fiction. In fact, my most recent book is about Shakespeare's influence on science fiction. But I have to admit, I never formally taught The Handmaid's Tale, although next year I am going to be putting it on my science fiction module for the first time. But I am really interested in both that novel in particular and in dystopian science fiction in general. So I'm just going to begin by showing you an overview. Now, I may not go through all these topics, these themes in precisely this order. I'll be moving in between them slightly, but I want to offer some thoughts both on dystopian science fiction in general and, of course, on The Handmaid's Tale in particular, how it fits into that genre, how it perhaps reflects the influence of earlier writers such as Huxley or Orwell. And as you can see here, I'm going to touch on the themes of environmentalism, feminism, religion, surveillance, and race, which are relevant to this novel and to other dystopian science fiction works. I thought it might be useful to offer you a few quotations just to indicate what people mean when they talk about dystopian science fiction. Some of you may be very familiar with this term. Some of you may not feel completely confident about its meaning. So I've got both these quotes from an online resource, which is really useful if you're working on science fiction. It's called the Science Fiction Encyclopedia. And the first statement is quite simple. The word dystopia denotes that class of hypothetical, so imaginary or fictional society, containing images of worlds worse than our own. So quite simple, a simple point there, that dystopian societies are worse than our own society. And then the next quotation, the next extract, elaborates that a little. Dystopian images are almost invariably images of future society, pointing fearfully at the way the world is supposedly going in order to provide urgent propaganda for a change in direction. So that's an important characteristic of dystopian science fiction, both its content, the kind of stories dystopian science fiction tells, the kind of settings it dreams up, but also the purpose behind it. Not always, but a lot of science fiction writers who create dystopian futures are trying to send a message to us. They're trying to say, don't keep on doing what you're doing, or you may end up like this. I'll just give you one quite topical example which reflects a current anxiety. And this is a really gripping science fiction thriller by a writer called Rob Hart called Warehouse. And it's set in a huge corporation, which is like a kind of blend of Google and Amazon, and about how the lives of employees are totally taken over by this huge company, and all their freedoms and their rights get eroded. So that's a very typical 21st century dystopian work. So I'll pause here, having said a little bit about the dystopian genre, just to give you the chance to think back over your reading, your viewing, and consider whether you're familiar with any dystopian science fiction apart from probably The Handmaid's Tale itself. I can't see the chat at the moment, so I will, of course, just be carrying on, but do feel free to put your ideas in the chat. And I thought some of you might have read some contemporary young adult fiction which is dystopian, because that's a very popular subgenre at the moment for young adult fiction. And it's not so recent now, but I've put one example there as the illustration, which is The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins, which is a very popular film trilogy. And I've recently started teaching it on our own science fiction module here at Anglo Ruskin. It always goes down well. And lots of other science fiction, TV, film, and 20th century classics that you might have come across in the dystopian genre. So I'll just pause really briefly how you to think about that.
I'm just going to quickly offer a little point of what Wikipedia calls disambiguation, as it were, which is to tease apart a possible, not confusion exactly, because the two genres are very related, but a kind of entwining between dystopian science fiction and post-apocalyptic science fiction, which is a distinct but related genre. So I've just repeated here the quotation I put up earlier relating to dystopia denoting that class of hypothetical societies containing images of worlds worse than our own, because of course that's also true of the genre known as post-apocalyptic science fiction, which typically takes place after some huge disaster, such as an asteroid hitting the Earth and wiping out nearly all of civilization, or a killer plague. And dystopian futures are similar in that they're also about a world which is worse than our own, but they tend to be slightly less, well, apocalyptic in their scenarios. They're more usually about some really authoritarian government. In fact, as I put a note here, one characteristic of dystopian science fiction is that it's characteristically more ordered, more regimented than the present. And for those, most of you, I'm sure, who've read The Handmaid's Tale, you can probably immediately see that that is true of The Handmaid's Tale. Everything is very regimented, with people ordered into different groups and lots of rules, of laws. One interesting thing to note about the example I mentioned earlier, The Hunger Games, is that it's got a bit of both in it. It's quite a complicated novel in that it depicts both quite a free and easy, very capitalist society in Panem, the capital, but also a very authoritarian society in District 13, this communist enclave, which is discovered in one of the later novels. So I'm going to say a little more about this kind of regimentation quickly. It's a very common characteristic of dystopian science fiction that human society, its people, are divided into castes or classes, groups. You might have different words for those sets. So in Brave New World, people are divided according to how they are literally designed and made in a test tube, that people are designed either to be experts, to be alphas, or to be the gammas and deltas who do all the very humdrum work and have a lower intelligence. And in 1984, people are divided according to their party membership. Are they inner party, the elite, or outer party, roughly the middle classes, or are they what Orwell refers to as the proles, the working classes, who in some ways have more freedom than other people? I won't go into details, but Veronica Roth's Divergent, popular young adult novel, was very focused around different groupings within society, and The Hunger Games, also with its different districts, very much fits into that that pattern. And here I've just put up a couple of pictures, one from an old 1980 version of Brave New World, and one from the recent Hulu Handmaid's Tale series, which show how different makers of science fiction find similar solutions to indicate how these castes, these segments of society, might work in practice. And in both Huxley's novel and the TV series, the different levels of society are indicated by the colour of their clothing. And the same is true in A Handmaid's Tale, with the handmaids, of course, being dressed in red, the wives in blue, and other groups having different coloured costumes, which are effectively like uniforms. You have to wear those clothes, that colour dress, or you'll get into trouble. So I was going to say a little bit more, just reflect slightly further on the significance of these castes, these different groups in dystopian science fiction, because they can be used for interestingly different purposes. Sometimes, as I indicated before, dystopian science fiction reinforces and exaggerates trends which are already in place in today's society. And one example of that can be found in what's now quite an old young adult novel called Daz for Zoe by Robert Swindells. I think that must be 20th century. I don't have the precise date, sorry, but it is set in a future England where the gaps between the rich and the poor, the middle class and the working class has become really, really exaggerated. So they're actually separated by physical barriers, as you can see on the cover illustration. And the underclass, the working class people, don't have the same opportunities to go to school and they can't vote. But in The Handmaid's Tale, I think there's an interesting difference in that the castes don't reflect, say, the social classes of the previous lives of these 20th century Americans, because very middle class people, successful professionals like Offred herself, simply because of their slightly irregular marital arrangements or whatever, can suddenly find themselves, as it says here, right at the bottom of society. So if you come across other examples of dystopian fiction where people are regimented very rigidly into different groups, it's interesting to ask these questions, to think how do they reflect the gaps that already exist in our own society. So I've already suggested that one of the purposes behind dystopian science fiction is to make people aware of dangers, of worrying trends in today's society, or of course the society at the time the novel was written, which could be in the 1930s or the 1950s, and perhaps try and prevent people being led astray, try and sort of nip that problem in the bud, as it were. So I'm just going to again pause and invite people to think what fears, maybe in the mid-20th century, maybe today, could or already have been developed into exaggerated dystopian futures. So I think it's interesting to be aware that the kinds of anxieties which people were preoccupied by in the mid-20th century, say, or the late 20th century, aren't always, although sometimes they are, the same ones that worry people today. And I'll just go on to the next slide where I've suggested some possible answers to my question. One anxiety which was very prominent in the mid-20th century was a fear of the Soviet Union and more generally of the communist system which dominated the Soviet Union. And that was particularly prevalent in the United States, which was very, very anti-Soviet, very anti-communist. But in later decades, I think increasingly towards the end of the 20th century and into this century, there's been almost an opposite turn where it's capitalism or extreme capitalism, sometimes perhaps referred to as neoliberalism, which is more of a threat or perceived to be more of a threat. So you have novels such as the one I mentioned earlier, Warehouse, about corporations getting a massive amount of power. So there's more anxiety about businesses and the threat they pose than about authoritarian states. Not surprisingly, Nazism was a key threat in the 1930s, 1940s. And after that, it continued to dominate a lot of science fiction, particularly in novels about what might have happened if the Nazis had won the war. That's another subgenre of science fiction called alternate history science fiction. And there are several really interesting examples of that scenario. A very different, rather less perhaps immediately perilous example of a fear is an anxiety that culture will be dumbed down, that people won't like reading books anymore. So one of the most famous examples of this is Ray Bradbury's 1950s American novel Fahrenheit 451, where books are burnt. But it's also relevant to 1984, where Newspeak is a new, very simplified form of English, which is going to take over from standard English and make literature effectively impossible. And finally, this is perhaps a fear which has become more prevalent towards the later 20th and 21st century, is a fear that machines and technology will prevent humans from forming relations with each other and destroy the natural world. And if you've seen the film Wall-E, the cartoon film, that's a really interesting example of that particular anxiety. So returning to The Handmaid's Tale, what fears drive that novel? What anxieties haunt it? I think there are quite a few. I guess the first one to mention is the fear of religious extremism, because that drives another hugely important fear, an anxiety that women's freedoms and reproductive rights will be curtailed. But you could sort of take a step back and say, well, one of the reasons why that government came to power, that extremist government in Gilead, was because of anxieties about the environment and about the threat of environmental damage to the survival of the human race. And finally, not quite such a predominant theme, but an interesting one, is a fear of surveillance. So surveillance is quite central in the novel. You get the eyes, you get these sort of secret police spying on everyone, but you also get sort of devices perhaps spying on people as well, but more of an emphasis, I think, on not so much an emphasis on technology, more of an emphasis on the fear that your friend might turn into a traitor and in fact be reporting on you to the secret police. So, as I said at the beginning, I'm going to be dipping in and out of The Handmaid's Tale because I really want to bring out the links between The Handmaid's Tale and dystopian fiction as a genre more generally. And I'm going to pause, first of all, on anxieties about environmental disaster, which is a huge topic in science fiction and takes many different forms. The novel I've pictured on the right here, Octavia Butler's Parable of the Sower, was written in the 1990s, and it hangs between, I think, dystopian fiction and apocalyptic science fiction in its depiction of a society which is ravaged by climate change and also by a very authoritarian but also very capitalist government in the United States. So as you probably know, the particular fear in The Handmaid's Tale, also related to environmental disaster, is anxiety about falling birth rates. And it's that which pressures people to give in to the regime of Gilead in the hope that it can produce more children for the future. This is a little bit of my diversion if you're studying the novel, which I think you mostly are, because it relates, I believe, purely to the TV series. But I think it's interesting that although on the whole, Gilead is just presented as a terrible society, but I noticed a little challenge to the viewer in the TV series, in that it seemed to be, as it were, hitting some of the right buttons that viewers would be expected to approve of, because it's gone completely organic. It's dramatically cut its carbon emissions, or certainly claims it has, and it's got rid of plastic packaging because it likes to do things in a very simple old-fashioned way. So, as I suggested, this isn't directly relevant to the novel, unless there's a reference to this, which I missed in the novel. I have to reread it. But I think it is still relevant to a comparable tension, which is definitely there in the novel and has been much discussed. A tension which may similarly pose a challenge to the reader who's trying to navigate the plot and work out exactly where their sympathies should lie. So this tension relates to the depiction of feminism and feminists in the novel, and specifically, or particularly perhaps, to the depiction of the character of Offred's mother, who is such an active feminist. And as I've noted here, as many other people have identified, there is an irony in an unexpected connection between positions taken by some feminists and positions taken by Gilead, even though you could say Gilead is obviously an incredibly anti-feminist regime. So this quotation describes pornography being burnt. So it says, there were some men too among the women, and the books were magazines. They must have poured gasoline because the flame shot high, and then they began dumping the magazines from boxes, not too many at a time. Some of them were chanting, onlookers gathered. Their faces were happy, ecstatic even, almost, sorry. And this quotation is a kind of ironic, twisted parallel to that, because it depicts people, again, burning things they don't approve of, and somewhat similar things related to the sexualization of women, because they're burning kind of glamorous clothes, sexy clothes. But here it's the religious extremists of Gilead who are doing the burning, not the feminists. So that, as I said, is an interesting tension in the novel, where it makes the reader pause and wonder what they're meant to think, what the answer, as it were, is. I'm not sure if this applies to any of you, but I know that in some examples, Atwood is studied alongside Mary Shelley's Frankenstein. So I'm not going to spend too long on this, because obviously you may not be studying Frankenstein, but there is an interesting link, I think, between that dynamic in The Handmaid's Tale, where you see that people are longing for something to come about, and the feminists want there to be no more pornography, and then that happens, but not at all in the way or for the reasons they wanted. And that reminds me of Victor Frankenstein, the scientist in Shelley's early 19th century novel, who spends months trying to create new life. And then as soon as he's succeeded, he turns from it in horror, realizing that he's created a monster. And you can see a picture of him there, leaving his creature that he's just made behind him in horror. Although it was published some decades ago now, The Handmaid's Tale has really come back into prominence, partly, of course, because the TV series has been extremely successful, but partly because of the feminist Me Too movement against sexual harassment. And there's an interesting recurrence of that kind of irony I was talking about earlier, because it seems as though Mary Shelley herself rather regrets some of the ways her novel has been used or interpreted. Now, this is a slightly dense slide. I'm not going to read out all of it, but just indicate the key points here. One of the things Margaret Atwood has been very concerned about is the fact that some men, particularly students, have sometimes been expelled from university, had accusations made against them without any due process, any way of defending themselves, following allegations of sexual misconduct. And as she says in the middle bullet point here, their ideology, and she's thinking about very liberal people here, not religious people, becomes a religion. Anyone who doesn't puppet their views is seen as an apostate, so that's someone who leaves their religion, a heretic or a traitor, and moderates in the middle are annihilated. So just as Offred's mother saw her battle against pornography reaching an ironically but dreadfully successful conclusion, so Atwood, although very much motivated by feminist concerns, now perhaps feels that some of her positions have been exaggerated or misunderstood. Just excuse me while I just keep an eye on the time there. Just don't want to go on too long. Very briefly, I want to just indicate that when she was writing in, say, the late 70s and then the 80s, the religious right was quite prominent in the United States. And one of the key characteristics of the religious right was their anxiety to keep women in their proper sphere, ensure that they, as far as possible, focused on being a wife and mother and didn't take on positions of leadership. So you can see how that position, that kind of ideology, fed into The Handmaid's Tale. But essentially, in the United States, it's always been more of a rumbling but fairly remote threat, although there have been recent steps taken to limit women's right to abortion in the United States, which could be seen as, you know, much more serious and more concrete potentially. But having said that, if we turn to other countries in the 70s, the 1970s, then you can see much more clearly how the scenario of The Handmaid's Tale was essentially a lived reality, not simply a threat for some. So here you have a picture of some casual young people in the 70s, dressed in their jeans and looking very relaxed. But this picture was taken in Iran just before the revolution, which forced women to dress in veils, which hid their hair and their figures. And on the right here is a cartoon by Margaret Satrapi, taken from her novel Persepolis, a graphic novel, which shows how some women who were called guardians of the revolution had the duty of ensuring that girls kept in line, that they kept their hair covered, and so on. So a little bit like the aunts in The Handmaid's Tale. And you could also invoke Afghanistan as presenting a similar horrifying scenario for women who wanted their freedom, their autonomy. I'm now going to turn to another theme, which I mentioned I would be touching on in relation to The Handmaid's Tale. And as I said before, in Atwood's novel, surveillance is maintained particularly by these human agents called the eyes. And I wanted to draw a connection between the way surveillance operates in The Handmaid's Tale and the way it operates in George Orwell's 1940s dystopian novel, 1984. Possibly some of you will have read that novel, and as I'll explain on the next slide, it features technology as a key tool in making sure that the state can control individuals. And it's one of those features of dystopian science fiction which has unfortunately become more of a reality today. So there's closed circuit television cameras, which obviously can be seen as a good thing in cutting down crime as well as a bad thing, but certainly some of the ways they're used, for example, by China to control the Uyghur Muslims, can be seen as very threatening and hostile. And I've put lots of examples here, which are perhaps a bit more in between, but for example, big businesses capturing personal information, the danger of Siri recordings, emotion detection software. So there's lots of different possibilities within today's surveillance culture because of how technology has developed. So I think it's really interesting to compare the way in which people's anxieties about the state are depicted in the 1948 novel, was it 1949? 1984 by George Orwell, and Atwood's novel. So the first quote here depicts Winston Smith, the protagonist of Orwell's novel, expressing his awareness of these things called telescreens, which are devices which can spy into your home and see what you're doing and make sure you're not breaking the law. And in this little extract, he's actually managed to escape from that surveillance and go into the country, but he's still worried about microphones perhaps picking up his voice. And that's echoed in The Handmaid's Tale when Offglen says that you're always safest out of door where there aren't any microphones. And another connection, again indicated in the next two little quotes, is between the ways in which the main characters of both novels fear that people who are in fact their allies could in fact be spies. So Winston says to Julia, his lover, you thought I was a good party. No, sorry, Julia says to Winston, you thought I was a good party member, pure in word and deed, banners, processions, slogans, games, community hikes, all that stuff. And you thought that if I had a quarter of a chance, I'd denounce you as a thought criminal and get you killed off. So I think that kind of anxiety, even if you haven't read 1984, will really resonate if you've read The Handmaid's Tale. And I just put a really quick little quote there to indicate that when Offglen says to Offred, you were always so stinking pious. Now, the final topic I want to look at in the last few minutes is one that may not seem extremely prominent in The Handmaid's Tale, but it is a very interesting one. And this is race. And if you have seen the TV series, you'll be aware that race is treated quite differently there than in the novel. But I want to say a little about how both the novel and the TV series have disappointed some viewers and readers because of the way racism and race as topics is handled in them. So first of all, here's a reminder that in the novel itself, the Black Americans are called children of Ham, which is an allusion to a story in the Bible, which is meant to explain racial differences. And they are resettled. They are taken away from the white people and made to work in colonies in very unfavourable circumstances. But we never find out much about them. And that's what lies behind this quote here from Noah Balatsky. Gilead obligingly moves Black people away, so the novel can present Black people's experiences without Black characters. Atwood critiques the regime, but also collaborates with it to push Black people aside. So what Balatsky's indicating here by saying the novel can present Black people's experiences is that there are lots of links between what happens to, well, the handmaids in particular, but not just the handmaids, and slaves going back to 19th century America. So here's an indication of how those links work. Both are treated as commodities, both are exploited for reproductive purposes as well as work purposes that might apply more to the Martha caste. Both are dehumanized and branded. Both slaves in the 19th century and the handmaids tried to escape to Canada. And there was a famous organization in 19th century America called the Underground Railroad, which is all about helping freed slaves, runaway slaves. And the network is called the Underground Female Road in The Handmaid's Tale. I think that term is only used in the epilogue, though, incidentally. And I thought it'd be interesting to show this cover of The Handmaid's Tale. One of the things we sometimes do with students is invite them to do presentations or write essays about how different novel covers, perhaps over decades, can tell us something about the different ways a novel has been interpreted. And what struck me about this particular novel, which isn't one of the best known ones, I don't think, so this particular cover, is that the handmaid depicted appears to be Black, although, as I suggest on the next slide, that could be debated, even though her skin colour clearly is black, because there is, as I've indicated in these middle illustrations, quite a tradition of using solely black images, silhouette images in illustration. So it could be that's what the illustrator has in mind, is intending. But her posture, that kneeling, that supplicant posture with her hands up, reminded me of a very famous medal depicting a slave. It's part of the anti-slavery movement. I put that on the right. Am I not a man and a brother? And I thought the black symbols that are kind of squiggling down the handmaid skirt, which also indicate poison and contamination, kind of chemical contamination, could be thought to echo the chains of the slave. So that's quite tentative. I'm not saying that the illustrator definitely had that image in mind, or that he or she intended that handmaid to be interpreted as black. But I think it just shows what Noah Blavatsky was thinking about when he said that Atwood was, in a sense, portraying the suffering of black people, of slaves, in a science fictional setting, a new setting, but without actual black people really playing a role in the novel. So just got, I think, one or two more slides now. I just wanted to briefly indicate that things become still more complicated when you take the TV series into account, because on the one hand, you could argue that by giving prominent roles to black actors, you're making race, you're making black characters much, much more visible, obviously, because Offred's best friend, Moira, and her husband, and that's their daughter, they're all black. But I think it can still be seen as somewhat problematic, as again, these quotations indicate. First of all, it's just strange, as Noah Blavatsky again says, that no one in the series seems to see or reference race. Gilead is virulently sexist and homophobic, but it is, to all appearances, less racist than the current United States. So that's interesting, that there doesn't seem to be any racial elements to the way people are punished or treated. You do get at least one, I think, black commander character. And here's another suggestive quotation. We know the depth of Moira's friendship with June before the Gilead takeover, but she is denied a connection to black family or black culture. That women of colour still only exist in this televised world by their proximity to white women, even after 2 seasons of valid critique, feels like a testament to a very white writer's room. So just finally, if you found that thought-provoking and you'd like to read something different, I recommend Colson Whitehead's The Underground Railroad, which was published about 5 or 6 years ago. And it's really interesting, not exactly science fiction, but it's got science fiction fantasy elements, but it's also very much about the real experience of slaves and black Americans in the later United States and the discrimination they faced. And it's also been made into a TV series. And also, in fact, the novel I illustrated through it with a cover design earlier, Octavia Butler's The Parable of the Sower. So that's another black science fiction writer with black central characters. So just a little bit of a contrast from The Handmaid's Tale. Thank you.
That is perfect. Thank you. That was really, really useful, really insightful, and thank you for, for being here to deliver that today. And I would love to open up the floor for any questions, if we do have any questions from attendees today. Heather did make a comment during your session a little earlier about a reference to going back to brown paper packaging, as plastic cannot be produced or obtained. And I know Heather has just put a comment in there as well. So
thank you for the reference to going back to brown paper packaging. Yes, that makes sense. And that really fits in with the novel. I think what the TV series did is just sort of oomph it up a bit, so it became part of the propaganda of Gilead. So they were trying to, as it were, greenwash their regime. So I think it was just exaggerated or emphasised a little more perhaps, but I will obviously have to reread the novel now. I'm going to be putting it on my module next year, and yes, I'd missed that because I think I may have prepared the slides before I read that novel. Though I have read it now. Yeah, I just missed that connection. So thank you for pointing that out. I should have made that connection. I really enjoyed the sequel. I found it's really hard to evaluate though, because I felt I knew The Handmaid's Tale so well, it becomes so iconic, that I found it difficult to tell whether The Testaments was just as good but not so familiar to me, or not quite as compelling. But I did think it was really interesting.
Thank you, Sarah. And do we have any questions at all from any of our attendees or anybody who was perhaps in the classroom? I know that Heather's typing.
Yes, yeah, I could see, someone typing, yeah.
Sorry, I'll shut up in a minute.
No, you're absolutely fine, Heather. If you're happy to unmute and ask out loud, then please do so. That's absolutely fine.
No, I was just responding, having read The Testaments and obviously knowing the Handmaid's Tale very well, just thought it was a very different kind of novel. But I think I read it alongside teaching Handmaids. First of all, I read it alone as one piece, and then went back to reading it alongside Handmaids and realised quite how many there's cross references there that are so clever.
Yes, I think I've devoured it rather quickly. I was so much just reading it for the story, so I probably would need to go back to it as well. And also it became very mixed up in my mind with the TV series, so I think I might now struggle to remember what was coming from which particular sort of iteration, what version of the story. Because I also found it, as well as finding the novel, the sequel, fascinating. I found the way in which the series looked more closely at some of the wives and some of the aunts really interesting, really thought-provoking.
Thank you, Sarah, and thank you, Heather, for sharing your comments there. That's really useful. Are there any questions at all that you would like to ask Sarah today? It can be, directly about the session that we've delivered, but if there is any questions about, English at ARU, then Sarah's a great person to ask any questions for. I'll give it a couple of minutes, Sarah, just in case we have any comments in the chat.
Yes, of course, yeah.
It might be actually quite useful, Sarah, to be honest, to give a little bit of background on, your journey with ARU, I suppose, and also what you teach on, maybe.
Yes, well, I can begin with the question that Heather's just put about it's second year. It's an optional module on science fiction, and I've just been revamping it because there was a few texts I've taught quite a few years, and it was difficult to do lots of changes in COVID because so much else going on. So I've just made lots of changes, and putting The Handmaid's Tale on is one of them. I've also gone back to one or two of the classics. I'm teaching War of the Worlds for the first time, and also slightly later classic, John Wyndham's The Chrysalids, as well as much more recent texts like Nnedi Okorafor's Lagoon, so African Nigerian writer. At ARU, I've been here for 16 years, so a long time now, and I have done lots of teaching on different courses, and currently a lot of my teaching is on, for example, a first year course is all about mythical in particular, but also biblical influences on English literature. So that is one of the courses alongside science fiction, which most reflects my interest, because I'm really interested in the Latin poet Ovid and myth and fantasy more generally. So we look at things like the story of Pygmalion, we compare it with Frankenstein and with Pinocchio. So that's one of the things I most enjoy teaching with the first years, but I also do quite a lot of postgraduate teaching, and I do an interdisciplinary, what's called a Ruskin module, which people from any department can do, and that's all about work, the past of work, the history of work, the present, changes in work in art and literature, and work in the future, so I get science fiction in there as well.
Thank you, Sarah. And I suppose it might be useful. I know we have got some classes here and year 12 students. Is there any advice perhaps that you would give to a student who might potentially be considering studying English at university? Is there anything specific that you would advise them to focus on in preparation for, that transition from further education into higher education?
Okay, I think that's a really good question. I think one of the biggest changes that strike students is how much more reading they have to do. So that's definitely something to bear in mind. I think because all literature teachers tend to be very enthusiastic, so we always want students to read all the things we're interested in. And when you're doing 4 courses at the same time, that needs some management. So you might want to ask for reading this in advance. I'd also say if you're thinking about doing English and not sure where, do look carefully at the different courses offered by universities, because they have a lot in common, but they have some characteristics which are different. You might think if you want to do something that's more traditional, something which gives you lots of opportunities to do creative writing, or something that's very employability focused. So I think at Anglia we offer a little of all of that, but we wouldn't do the very, very most traditional type of modules, such as, say, Anglo-Saxon, and only a little bit of medieval literature. But having said that, as well as looking at courses, that is important, but make sure you don't go to a university because of one particular module, because sometimes things change. The same thing applies if you meet one teacher you really like at an open day. People move around, but going to open days is really important, because I think you just immediately pick up a sense of the atmosphere, and it's not generally a case of, oh, one's good and one's bad. It's more what suits you. So you might have something that's really big and bustling in a huge city, or something that's much more cozy and domestic and pastoral and maybe in a slightly quieter setting. So definitely go to open days if you can.
That's really, really good advice, Sarah, and I would second that. Open days are really essential when it comes to choosing a university, because I think Sarah's covered it in great detail there, but it allows you to, one, get a feel for the university as a whole, but secondly, it allows you to meet, the academics that potentially will be teaching you across that 3-year undergraduate programme, as well as meeting, students that might already be studying on that course, so you can get a good feel for what that university can offer you. So it is really, really important. And as Sarah said, although courses may have the same title, the actual content of that degree from the 1st to the 3rd year might be entirely different when it comes to modules. So definitely do some research, and you can check out websites. I mean, the ARU website, if you were considering us, but as well as every other university, will usually have a module list. And that will allow you to sort of have a look at what that degree looks like, overall. And it's a really good way for you to sort of decide if that's going to be the right course for you. So yeah, thank you very much for that, Sarah. That is really, really useful.
And I've just put my email in, so do feel free to get in touch, whether you're a teacher or a student, if you'd like to find out more, or it could be a question about something to do with the novel, or about science fiction, of course, as well.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm just going to pop in the feedback form as well.
Oh yeah.
I don't think there has been any other questions, but I have just posted the link to the feedback form. And as I said at the beginning, it would be really, really appreciated if you could spend a moment just filling that in. It is very short, and it does allow us to sort of evaluate our sessions and to ensure that we can use this for our planning for the future. So yes, thank you so much. And I'll just like to say a final thank you to you, Sarah, for joining us today and for delivering the session, and also to the attendees, for hopping on this virtual event today. And I hope it has provided you with some insight and has been something quite useful to sort of coincide with your current studies. So thank you very much, everybody.
Oh, thank you. I can see
Mr. Tingle is typing.
Mr. Tingle is typing, and thank you. Oh, thank you. Yeah, I find that interesting. I'm going to be sometimes find it interesting to take a theme that the author wasn't thinking about and really shine a spotlight on that theme. So I'm going to be asking about race and gender in all the novels I'm teaching, even where it's not obviously a theme, sort of taking the novels by surprise, as it were. And thank you very much for hosting, Lauren, and for helping out with all the questions. And
no problem at all. I'm going to stop that recording there. Thank you very much, everybody, for attending, and perhaps we'll see you at some of the later sessions that we do have later on this week.